It is a great pleasure to welcome all of you who are listening to this program today, and also our two speakers. This is a program of the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research, and it is the first of a three-part series on the origins and ideology of Hamas. I am Jonathan Brent, Executive Director and CEO of the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. I want to thank truly and profoundly Professor Jeffrey Herf for curating this series and putting together our speakers and the subjects of the programs. Today's program, Hamas and the Origins of Islamic Antisemitism, will include Professor Herf and Dr. Matthias Küntzel. Jeffrey Herf studies the intersection of ideas and politics in modern European history, specializing in 20th century Germany. He has published extensively on Germany during the Weimar Republic, Nazi Germany, the Holocaust, and on West and East Germany during the Cold War. His research interests now focus on Nazi period and German and European history in post-World War II decades up to the collapse of communism and the end of the Cold War in 1989. He is the author of numerous works, including Nazi Propaganda for the Arab World, 2009, from Yale University Press, Israel's Moment, 2022, and most recently, The Three Faces of Antisemitism, 2023. Matthias Küntzel is a political scientist based in Hamburg, Germany. Between 2004 and 2015, he was an external research associate at the Vidal Sassoon International Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. His published works include Jihad and Jew Hatred, Islamism, Nazism, and the Roots of 9/11, 2007, and Nazis, Islamic Antisemitism in the Middle East, the 1948 Arab War against Israel, and the aftershocks of World War II, 2024. He is a member of the German Council on Foreign Relations in Berlin and the Advisory Board of United Against Nuclear Iran in New York. Welcome. Future programs in this series that have been curated by Jeffrey Herf include Colonialism, Racism, and the Arab-Israeli War of 1948, which will take place on Monday, March 25th at 1 p.m. and will include, along with Professor Herf, Benny Morris, and then a larger panel discussion on April the 16th, responses to October 7th. For more information about both of those programs, please check out YIVO's website. A great historian once observed that it is not the historian's function to judge, so much as to analyze and describe. That is the aim of the series and the aim of today's discussion. It is our hope that these discussions will elucidate an element in the October 7 attack of Hamas on the border kibbutzim of Israel that has too often been ignored or obscured by emotional rhetoric and propaganda, or by so-called contextualization, lost in much of the public discussion in mainstream media and in American universities and colleges, amid cliches and factual distortions such as Zionism equals racism, or Zionism is Nazism, or from the river to the sea, has been a historical assessment of the origins and ideology of Hamas and the relationship between those origins and ideology and its actions on October 7th. It is doubtful if a set of programs of this sort could even take place on a college campus today. However, I believe this historical assessment is not simply an academic parlor game, but is an important factor in understanding the tragedy not only of October 7th and its aftermath, but of the much wider conflict that has engulfed the Middle East since the United Nations voted on 29 November 1947. A question has arisen among some in the YIVO community as to why YIVO, an institution known most widely as one that promotes and teaches the Yiddish language and the cultural legacy of East European and Russian Jews should undertake such a program? Let me try to explain. In 1952, M.D. Reumann, Stalin's principal interrogator in the anti-Semitic so-called Doctor's Plot of 1953, which led to the widespread arrest, torture, and social stigmatization of the Jews of the Soviet Union, began his interrogation of an arrested Jewish MGB, later to be known as the KGB officer, Isidor Matyarsky. He began with the following accusation, which recalled the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a work purportedly revealing the Jewish plot for world domination and formerly banned in the Soviet Union. Reumann began. In Moscow, there live more than 1.5 million Jews. They have seized the medical posts, the legal profession, the union of composers, and the union of writers. I am not even speaking of their trade networks. Other such references to the protocols appeared in the course of Stalin's anti-Semitic campaign, as when another high-ranking Jewish MGB officer, also arrested, was forced to confess, I referred contemptuously to Russians and in every way praised Jews, elevating their intelligence and abilities, declaring that really by their history, Jews were chosen to rule over the world. Accordingly, we expressed the view that it was necessary for Jews in the USSR and other countries to take the example of American Jews, who had penetrated into all chinks of the economic and political life of the country, demonstrating influence over the foreign and domestic politics of the American government. Clearly, the Soviet Union, the leader of the socialist world at the time, had taken a turn to the right by embracing this anti-Semitic slander of Nazi Germany and Tsarist Russia. But this turn to the right was not without precedent, having been anticipated long before in what was to many the nearly incomprehensible pact of August 1939 between Hitler and Stalin. This pact between left and right in the 1990s, known in Russia as the Red-Brown Alliance, seems to have current relevance in the circumstances of October 7th, in the circumstances of the October 7th attack on Israel, and how this attack has been received in many quarters of the progressive left in America and Europe. One need only read Article 22 of the 1988 Hamas Charter, which states, and I'll read it, with the Jews' money, they took control of the world media, news agencies, the press, publishing houses, broadcasting stations, and others. With their money, they stirred revolutions in various parts of the world with the purpose of achieving their interests and reaping the fruit therein. They were behind the French Revolution, the Communist Revolution, and most of the revolutions we heard and hear about here and there. With their money, they were able to control imperialistic countries, and instigate them to colonize many countries in order to enable them to exploit their resources and spread corruption. You may speak as much as you want about regional and world wars. They were behind World War I when they were able to destroy the Islamic Caliphate. Making financial gains and controlling resources, it was they who instigated the replacement of the League of Nations with the United Nations and the Security Council to enable them to rule the world through them. There is no war going on anywhere in the world without their having their finger on it. Why then at YIVO? The intersection of European, Nazi, Soviet anti-Semitism with Palestinian anti-Semitism represents a penetration into the Middle East of the most virulent strains of that ideology which justified the murder of some 6 million Jews of Europe. The brutality and indiscriminate nature of the violence of October 7th suggests that that ideology is very much alive today. The YIVO Institute possesses some 24 million documents that have recorded the life of the Jewish people of Eastern Europe and their descendants around the world for over 500 years. Of these 24 million, over 7 million primary source materials pertain directly or indirectly to the Holocaust, making YIVO's the largest archive of Holocaust-related material in the world outside of Yad Vashem. What is the use of these materials What is the use of this legacy of caring? What is the use of our preserving this heritage of the Jewish people? If it does not today compel us to take seriously and investigate this great threat that has arisen, perhaps outside the geographical boundaries of our customary interests, but entirely and well within the intellectual and the spiritual boundaries that have defined the YIVO Institute for nearly 100 years. And so with that, I would like to now turn to Professor Herf for his opening statement.
Well, Jonathan, thank you very, very much. And I am indebted, we are indebted to you, your insight and your courage to support this initiative. The title of my remarks is The Second Era of Underestimation, Hamas and its Ideology Before and Since October 7, 2023. In this series of 3 webinars, in the traditions of a research institute such as YIVO, we seek to bring scholarship, light, or the heat, about the origins and ideology of Hamas, to bring this scholarship to the attention of a broader audience. Ever since the aggression of October 7th, the major newspapers and media, in our view, have done far too little to bring its ideological core to the attention of a mass audience. And it's my view, I think it's our view, that the fundamental cause of this war, of all of its horrible suffering and death, lies in the inflamed ideology of the leaders of Hamas. The short-term purpose of the attack was, as newspapers have reported, to derail the prospect of closer relations with Israel with other Arab states in the Abraham Accords, and, as in the past, prevent a peaceful compromise solution to the conflict over borders and territory known as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Our goal is to draw attention to the longer-term causes, which we believe lie in the ideological convictions of the founders of Hamas. Hamas is in the tradition of what historians call Islamism. That is, a particular interpretation of the religion of Islam that emerged in the Muslim Brotherhood in the 1920s. In September of 1937, Hajj Amin al-Husseini, who was appointed in the 1920s by the British to be the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, was a man on the run because the British were attempting to arrest him for his role in supporting terrorist attacks against Jews and moderate Arabs in British Mandate Palestine. In his absence, Husseini had a text read at a conference in Houdan, Syria, in September of 37. In 1938, the speech, Islam and the Jews, was published in German translation in Nazi Berlin. In that text, Husseini interpreted the Quran and the biography of Muhammad to mean that, quote, the battle between Jews and Islam began when Muhammad fled from Mecca to Medina. In those days, the Jewish methods were exactly the same as in the 20th century. Then, quote, they tried to annihilate the Muslims. And just as the Jews were able to betray Muhammad, so they will betray the Muslims today. The verses of the Quran and the Hadith assert that the Jews were Islam's most bitter enemy and, moreover, tried to destroy it. In Islam and the Jews, Husseini argued that the Zionist project was only the most recent episode of 7 centuries of Jewish attacks on the religion of Islam and on Muslims, and that therefore the effort to prevent the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine was a religious obligation of all Muslim believers. His Islamist interpretation of the religion of Islam presented it as one inherently hostile to the religion of Judaism, to the Jews as a people, and therefore to the Zionist project in Palestine. We historians of Europe, of Christianity, Judaism, know that these religions are capable of multiple interpretations. And by no means do we mean to be suggesting that Hajj Amin al-Husseini is representative of the religion of Islam. And so when we use the phrase Islamist anti-Semitism or even Islamic anti-Semitism, we're referring to a specific tradition that emerged in the middle of the 20th century that interpreted the religion of Islam in a particular manner. Husseini avoided capture by the British, and he found asylum in Nazi Berlin in 1941. He met Nazi Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop and then Hitler himself. The photo of the two was published around the world. Husseini arrived with an entourage, including the talented radio announcer Yunus Bahri. My study, Nazi Propaganda for the Arab World, in 2009 drew on German archives and the translations done by American diplomats in Cairo, who offer the fullest account of 4 years of anti-Jewish hatred in Arabic in Nazi Germany's Arabic language broadcasts. Occasionally, Hashim al-Husseini spoke in his own name on the radio, as he did on December 23rd, 1942, at an address on the opening of the Islamic Institute in Berlin. He combined the theme of Islam and the Jews, his own autonomous, indigenous intellectual creation, which was not a product of Nazi propaganda. He combined it with the conspiracy theories of Nazi propaganda. He said, quote, "The Jews have spread their influence over Britain. They dominate America. They are behind destructive and atheist communism. They have brought people against each other. And the catastrophes and tragedies which are happening now are caused by the Jews. The first enemies of the Muslims are today the Jews and the British and the Americans who support them," unquote. As many of you know, during the Holocaust, Adolf Hitler said the Jews intended to exterminate the Germans and that Germany would retaliate by exterminating the Jews instead. He presented the Holocaust as a massive act of self-defense. Husseini and others participating in the Nazi Arabic propaganda added another element to the Jews' plans. On November 3rd of 1943, the Voice of Free Arabism in Berlin was entitled "Palestine Between the Bolsheviks and the Jews." It asserted that the Jews, especially in Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union, quote, "kindled this war in the interests of Zionism. The world will never be at peace until the Jewish race is exterminated. Otherwise, wars will always exist. The Jews are the germs which have caused all the trouble in the world." In January and February, March 1944, much to the displeasure of American officials in the Pentagon, senators and members of the House of Representatives in Washington introduced resolutions in support of the creation of a Jewish Commonwealth of Palestine. In response, Husseini said the following in a broadcast of March 1944, quote, "The wicked American intentions toward the Arabs are now clearer, and there remain no doubts that they are endeavoring to establish a Jewish empire in the Arab world. More than 400 million Arabs oppose this criminal American involvement. Arabs, exclamation. And then this is an emphasis in the original. Rise as one and fight for your sacred right. Kill the Jews wherever you find them. This pleases God, history, and religion. This serves your honor. God is with you," unquote. In the last year of World War II, the great Brooklyn Democratic Congressman Emanuel Seller, one of the great political figures of American 20th century political history, urged that Husseini and other foreign collaborators with the Nazis be included among those to be indicted in war crimes trials that were then being planned. American Zionists and their liberal and left-leaning supporters in the press and politics, especially in New York, engaged in an unsuccessful effort to bring Husseini to trial. Without success, they urged the French government, which held him under house arrest from May of 1945 to June of 1946, to extradite him to Britain for a war crimes trial. In the process, they produced a remarkable amount of material regarding his wartime collaboration with Nazi Germany, certainly enough to have justified an indictment. Nevertheless, as the files of the French Foreign Ministry make clear, the French government decided that sending Husseini to be tried for war crimes would damage French colonial interests in North Africa and the Middle East. His house arrest at a villa outside Paris was so lenient that in June 1946, he was able to escape in disguise, fly on a TWA flight to Cairo. The government of Egypt granted him asylum and provided a security detail around his residence. He was among those Nazi collaborators, and we German historians have a great deal, and European historians have written a great deal about this development within Europe. He was among those Nazi collaborators who benefited from the arguments of the early Cold War, that the Nazi past should be put in the past in order to focus on the communists. When Husseini returned to Cairo, he received a hero's welcome. But his most enthusiastic admirer was a man named Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood. On June 11th of 1946, al-Banna issued the following statement. The hearts of the Arabs palpitated with joy at hearing that the Mufti has succeeded in reaching an Arab country. What a hero, what a miracle of a man. Yet this hero, who challenged and fought Zionists with the help of Hitler and Germany and Hitler are gone. But Amin al-Husseini will continue the struggle. The Lord Almighty did not preserve Amin for nothing. There must be a divine purpose behind the preservation of this man, namely the defeat of Zionism. Al-Banna's remarkable statement made clear that Husseini would continue to struggle against the Jews, that now this struggle was the defeat of Zionism. And indeed, Husseini did exactly that. As he reemerged as the leader of the Palestine Arab, he rejected the United Nations partition resolution of 1947, would have given the Palestine Arabs a large part of the British Mandate territory. And he began a civil war that in May of 1940, Arab states escalated when they invaded the new state of Israel in May of 48. From 1948 to the establishment of the Islamic Republic of Iran in 1979-80, Islamist organizations faded in world politics into the background. Their support for Nazi Germany, their religiously grounded hatred of Judaism, the Jews, and therefore the state of Israel, were in those decades disqualifying features in a post-war world with fresh memories of the horrors of Nazism. During the crucial years of 1947-48, diplomatic and military support by the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc was crucial for the establishment of the state of Israel. However, as we'll discuss in March, once it became clear that to Stalin that the new state of Israel was not going to be an agent of Soviet influence in the Middle East, he turned against it. And Soviet propagandists repressed the history of Soviet support for the Zionist project and placed the global prestige of anti-fascism in the service of a campaign to undermine the state of Israel, to make the term Zionist a term of abuse, and turn the cause of something called the Palestinians, as if there was one Palestinian view, represented in those years by the Palestine Liberation Organization, into a cause of the radical left. The Islamic Resistance Movement, or Hamas, published its founding covenant or charter in 1988. In this climate of global antagonism to Israel, secular Arab leftist defeat, and the impact of the Iranian Revolution of '79 and the resulting Islamic Republic. It's essential reading. We can only do so much in a webinar. And one of the things that we're hoping to do is to encourage all of you who are listening to take time to read crucial texts. Unlike, there was great debate, and still is, about whether the Palestine Liberation was inherently anti-Semitic organization or not. And we're not going to enter that debate and discussion today. But there is no debate, none, that the Hamas Charter is a classic statement of Jew hate. If it is not an example of Jew hatred and anti-Semitism, the term is empty meaning. It claimed to speak in the name of the most merciful Allah. It quoted the martyr Hassan al-Banna of blessed memory, quote, that Israel will exist and will continue to exist until Islam will obliterate it, just as it obliterated others before it. It claims to speak in the name of Islam. And I repeat, we do not agree that Hamas represents Islam. We do not agree that criticizing Hamas charter is a form of something called Islamophobia. But what we do agree is bringing the voice of Hamas in its own words to the attention of this audience. The charter stressed that, quote, our struggle against the Jews, not the Zionists, not the imperialists, not the colonialists, our struggle against the Jews is very great and very serious. It declared that by adopting Islam as its way of life, the movement goes back to the time of the birth of the Islamic message of the righteous ancestor, where Allah is its target, the Prophet is its example, and the Quran is its constitution. It presented itself as the interpretation of the religion of Islam, and it evokes the spirit of the 7th century. Its goal was to, quote, raise the banner of Allah over every inch of Palestine. And by Palestine, it is referring not to the West Bank or to Gaza only, but to what was then all of the state of Israel. It called the obliteration of Israel to be a religious obligation. Quote, the day of judgment will not come about until Muslims fight the Jew, killing the Jew, when the Jew will hide behind stones and trees. It celebrated the destruction of Israel as part of an apocalyptic, murderous theodicy, a redemption. Article 11 reasserted that the land of Palestine is an Islamic block or property, consecrated for future Muslim generations until judgment. Article 13 rejected international conferences or negotiations. Quote, there is no solution for the Palestinian question except through jihad. Initiatives, proposals, and international conferences are all a waste of time and vain endeavors, unquote. Jihad, in the context of the Hamas Charter of 1988, meant waging war against Israel. As Jonathan quoted from Article 22 of the Charter, I can save a great deal of time by not repeating what he had to say. I would point this out, that subsequently famous Article 22 incorporates the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories of Europe in what up to then in the March 1988 document, is primarily an Islamist interpretation of Islam. And the incorporation of specifically Nazi language and interpretation into the Hamas Charter is that the Jews were behind World War II. The Nazis claimed the Jews were behind World War I, but they over and over again repeated that the Jews were the driving force of the anti-Hitler coalition in Moscow, London, and Washington. And the Hamas Charter incorporated that ridiculous interpretation of the Second World War into its founding text. The Nazis also claimed in their propaganda that the Zionists wanted to expand from the Nile to the Euphrates, not just the historic land of Palestine, and that language is also in the Charter. The publication of the Hamas Charter met with a resounding lack of world media. On June 5th, 1993, the Washington Post published 5 paragraphs of its 36 articles and 9,000 words. The first mention of the Charter in the New York Times that I could find, and perhaps there were previous ones, but I haven't found them, appeared on April 16, 2009, in a very fine 220-word letter to the editor by the late Israeli political theorist Shlomo Evaniri. In the years since, the Times has not published extensive sections on the Charter, nor has it offered its readers an article that fully presented its argument. In 1998, in the Journal of Middle Eastern Studies, Meyer Litton, a historian of the Middle East at Tel Aviv University, published, quote, the Islamization of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. I think it was the first scholarly article in English about the Charter. In 2003, in the aftermath of al-Qaeda's attacks of 9/11, Sa-Iraq, a small left-leaning press in Freiburg, Germany, published Matthias Küntzel's important, very important work, Jihad and Judenhass über die neuen jüdischen Krieg, Jihad and Jew hatred on the new war against the Jews, on the new anti-Jewish war. As far as I know, my colleague Matthias Küntzel was the first, his interpretation was the first public description of the Charter and its significance by any scholar in Europe or the United States. He described the Charter as probably the most important programmatic document in contemporary Islamism. In 2008, the Charter was posted in English on the Avalon Project for Diplomacy, History, and Law of the Yale Law School. It is a website regularly consulted by historians around the world doing research and teaching on, among other things, the Nuremberg War Crimes trial. In 2010, Litvak published Martyrdom is Life, Jihad and Martyrdom in the Ideology of Hamas in the Specialist Studies in Conflict and Terror. In 2014, in the pages of American Interest magazine, I published Hamas' little-known fascist charter, in which I presented its key assertion. The essay is reprinted and just published, Three Faces of Antisemitism. Judging from published articles, attention in the major press and media, the Charter of 1988 aroused little interest among journalists, human rights organizations, most scholars focused on the Middle East, or even Jewish scholars, scholars of Jewish and Israel studies. This lack of attention in the academy to the Charter's Islamic dimension of Jew hatred and a hatred of Israel found a counterpart in the paucity of attention in public discussion. Since October 7th, I have often wondered if the reverse had been the case and the press had been full of discussions of the Hamas Charter. Perhaps the Hamas dictatorship established in 2007 would have collapsed, or Hamas would have been placed in the court of world public opinion, placed on the defensive, and perhaps this horrible war and all of its suffering and death would not have happened. In 2017, I want to be brief and summarize here, Hamas published a statement which some journalists mistakenly thought revised or rejected the original charter. But when one reads the 2017 statement clearly, carefully, it is clear that it does no such thing, that the intention of Hamas to destroy the state of Israel, all of the state of Israel, it continues. And what Hamas has done both before and since 2007, and the way it translates ideology into action, indicates the continuing impact of its core beliefs. Hamas is often called, in recent months, a terrorist organization, and that it certainly is. But not only, because this terrorist organization became a mini dictatorship, it became a mini state in Gaza, whose purpose was to wage war to destroy Israel. It spent millions that could have been used to improve the life of the people of Gaza on a stupendous construction project that astounded even Israeli intelligence and military leaders. The ideological origins of the attack of October 7th were longstanding in public. We historians of the Nazi era refer to the problem of underestimation in the 1930s. Too few leaders and observers took Hitler's threats to murder the Jews seriously enough. Similarly, the absurdities of the Hamas Charter of 1988 and its determination to destroy Israel again in 2017 were met on the whole with what I'm calling a second era of underestimation. That second era is less excusable in view of the lessons that many of us historians have drawn from the 1930s and 1940s. The cultural references, the language, the chants, the costumes, the slogans, they're different, but the war against the Jews continued unabated. This time with a more explicitly religious justification. The road from Husseini's Islam and the Jews in 1937 to the Hamas Charter of 1988 to the tunnel construction and the attack of October 7th is long and it is winding and it is complex, but the evidence of its existence is clear and compelling. We should also ponder the following in conclusion. The Hamas Charter was written 43 years ago. Scholars should be asking, why did the Jew hatred of the 1930s and 40s persist? Israel's adversaries have a ready answer. It persists because of Israeli injustice. The Jews and the Zionists are yet again guilty. Today, we are pointing to another contrasting causal factor, another, to use that now famous word, context, namely the Islamist interpretation of the religion of Islam that emerged in the 1930s, was evident in 1988 and on October 7th. It is, in my view, the single most important cause of this terrible war now taking place. The history of this strange, powerful Islamist ideology merits more scholarly and public attention now and in the coming years. In planning this series of webinars, we draw your attention to a body of scholarship and work of historians of the past quarter century, which offers a sound foundation and a starting point for examining the ideas and the politics, which yet again were underestimated for far too long. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey. Thank you very much. One thing before we continue, Jeffrey, there have been some comments that the sound has been cutting in and out, and it has been suggested that when you speak, if you would bring the microphone closer, the audio would be better.
I'll be glad to do that.
Matthias Küntzel.
Okay, first of all, I would like to say thank you to Jonathan Brand and Jeffrey Herf for inviting me. It is a great honor to be able to participate as a speaker in this outstanding webinar series. Why were the victims of October 7 killed? Were they killed as a reaction to oppression by Israel or because of their Jewishness? To answer this question, we need to understand the ideological concept of the murderers and its historical background. Hamas' 1988 charter remains the most important source for this. When Hamas published a document of general principles in 2017, it emphasized that its 1988 charter is still valid. In the next few minutes, I would like to look at two historical sources that shaped this charter. Firstly, the jihad idea of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, and secondly, the anti-Semitism of the Nazis. Let me start with a quote from a well-known Palestinian politician, Sari Nusayb. He stated that the Hamas Charter of 1988, I quote, sounds if it came straight from the pages of Der Stürmer, end quote. And he is right. Not only are the atrocities of October 7 reminiscent of Nazi atrocities, but the ideological justifications for the murder of Jews in 1941 and the murder of Jews in October 2023 are similar, as Professor Herf has just shown. But how can we explain the fact that we find echoes of Hitler's anti-Semitism in the Hamas Charter? I would like to answer this question on the basis of new research findings. This research proves that National Socialism had a greater influence on the development of the Middle East conflict than previously assumed. In the first part of my paper, I would like to explain this influence by the Nazis by using three examples. First of all, there was a cooperation between the Nazis and the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. Hamas presents itself as a wing of the Muslim Brotherhood in Palestine and draws a line in its charter from the beginning of the Brotherhood's anti-Zionist jihad in the 1930s. At that time, however, with the explicit approval of Joseph Goebbels, meetings took place between Nazi agents in Egypt and the leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood, who also hated Jews and fought Zionism. The Germans transferred large sums of money to this Islamist group, organized joint Palestine meetings and joint educational events on the Jewish question, and supported the Brotherhood's most important ally, the Mufti of Jerusalem, Amin al-Husseini. The Nazis wanted to radicalize the anti-Zionism of the Muslim Brotherhood and turn the territorial conflict over Palestine into an irreconcilable anti-Jewish religious war. This is why they published the pamphlet Islam and the Jews in 1938 and distributed it in large numbers and in several languages during the Second World War. Islam and Jews is a shocking text that uses the religion of Islam solely to incite hatred of the Jews. In this way, Nazi propaganda combined Islam with anti-Jewish agitation to an extent that had not hitherto been known in the modern world. Secondly, from 1939 on, the Nazis launched their radio propaganda in Arabic language in order to reach the illiterate masses. In this way, Goebbels' anti-Semitism resounded in the Arab world every evening between April 1939 and April 1945. Jeffrey Herf, in his seminal study, Nazi Propaganda for the Arab World, has shown how this 6-year barrage of sound embedded European anti-Semitism in the consciousness of the Arab street. These broadcasts were well done with excellent and famous speakers, carefully selected Arab music, and a very good sound quality. Its programs, of course, were rebel-rousing. Their aim was not to inform, but to incite the Muslims against the Brits and the Jews. According to contemporary sources, their anti-Jewish agitation was effective because the Nazis could build on the patterns of early Islamic anti-Judaism, and they could instrumentalize the local conflict with the Zionists. This brings me to my third and final point: the 1948 Arab War against the newly founded Israel, a war that Hamas proudly refers to in its charter. The Nazi radio in Arabic language had to cease operation in April 1945, but its frequencies of hatred remained virulent. Thus, the idea of thwarting a Jewish state at any cost lived on and found a new home in Egypt, where after 1945, the Muslim Brotherhood built the world's largest anti-Semitic movement. By 1948, its membership has risen to 1 million. Today, hardly anyone knows how controversial the 1948 war was among Arab leaders. The Arab League, unanimously opposed to the two-state solution for Palestine, advocated by the United Nations in November 1947. However, how to react to the United Nations decision was heavily disputed until the last minute. On several occasions, the Arab League and Egypt in particular ruled out the possibility of an attack by regular Arab forces on the Jewish state. They had good reasons for rejecting a regular war. Firstly, this Arab war was a massive violation of the United Nations Charter. Secondly, it was an affront to the USA and the Soviet Union, as well as to all progressive forces that had previously fought the Nazis. Thirdly, there was only a small minority of Palestinian Arabs who wanted this war. And fourthly, with the exception of the Arab Legion of Transjordan, the Arab armed forces were in a pitiful state. Why did this official war against Israel nevertheless take place? My most recent book, entitled Nazis, Islamic Antisemitism in the Middle East, provides evidence that it was primarily pressure from the Arab street and the anti-Semitic campaigns of the Muslim Brotherhood that led the Arab rulers to overcome all their doubts and to attack Israel. The Brotherhood could draw on the lingering echoes of the anti-Semitic Nazi propaganda, in which preventing the emergence of a Jewish state at any cost had been a constant theme. The Muslim Brotherhood's propaganda was thus able to create an atmosphere in which war against the Jewish state seemed to be the only logical and natural course of action. They formed a nationalist mass movement that longed for the catharsis of a military confrontation and whipped up a tidal wave of public anger. In this feverish atmosphere, no Arab leader felt able to successfully resist the Brotherhood's warmongering. But the story doesn't end here. In retrospect, there is no doubt that those 6 years of daily Nazi radio propaganda marked a turning point that divided Middle Eastern history into a before and an after. These years fostered an exclusively anti-Jewish reading of the Quran, as in the Hamas Charter of 1988. They popularized the European world conspiracy myth, as in the Hamas Charter. They shaped a genocidal rhetoric towards Zionism, as in the Hamas Charter. It is thus no coincidence that Hamas speaks the language of Nazis when it comes to Jews. And it is no coincidence that when Hamas first encountered unprotected Jews on October 7, it tortured and murdered them as only the Nazis had done before. We have to conclude that in terms of ideas, there is a Nazi connection to Hamas. No wonder then that Israeli soldiers recently found in Gaza an Arabic translation of Mein Kampf and a book written by Mahmoud al-Zahar, a co-founder of Hamas, which hails the Holocaust and calls for nations to follow what the Nazis have done. However, anti-Semitism is only one element of Hamas ideology. In addition, Article 8 of its charter quotes the slogan of Hamas, which is at the same time the motto that the Muslim Brotherhood chanted on the streets of Cairo back in the 1930s. I quote, "Allah is our goal, the Prophet our model, the Quran our constitution, jihad our path, and death for the case of Allah, the loftiest of our wishes." But what does the slogan, "The Quran is our constitution," mean? It means that Hamas wants a theocracy in which people do not decide on laws, but the Quran is the constitution that is the supreme law. It is therefore also clear why Hamas hates Israel, not primarily for what its government does, but for what it is, a self-determined democracy. And what does the call, "Jihad is our path," mean? It means that peace negotiations are not only rejected, but actively torpedoed. A peace with Israel that would benefit the Palestinians. This is the nightmare of the Hamas leadership, which wants Israel's destruction. It exploits the suffering of those living in Gaza instead of eliminating it in order to gain new recruits for its jihad. And this is the final slogan of the Muslim Brotherhood and of Hamas. Death for the case of Allah is the loftiest of our wishes. According to the Quran, a martyr's death secures the person killed a privileged place in paradise. And since the Quran is known to always be right, this results in a win-win situation for jihadists. Either they are the winners within this world, or they die and enjoy the paradise of the afterlife. For Islamists, however, not only their own lives have little value, but also, as we are currently experiencing, the lives of other Muslims. They are abused and sacrificed en masse as human shields. Without these human shields, Hamas would be weak in the current war and probably already defeated, while in all other wars, weapons are supposed to protect people. In the ongoing war, it is people who are supposed to protect the weapons. The more Arab civilians are killed, the better for the Hamas propaganda that Israel is out to kill civilians, especially children. For Israel, this is a lose-lose situation. Either it loses the rocket war because it cannot defend itself, or it defends itself, kills civilians too, and loses the propaganda war. It is therefore not only hatred of Jews that determines Hamas behavior, but also the Quran, the idea of jihad and martyrdom. It is a religious war, and therefore an irreconcilable war that Hamas is waging against Israel, the Jews, and its own population. Anyone who ignores the religious motive of Hamas will hardly be able to understand the inner logic of its behavior. In the charter of Hamas, both components, jihad and Jew hatred, come together and mutually reinforce one another. European anti-Semitism is radicalized through connection with the fanatical aspects of Islam. At the same time, the traditional image of the dhimmi Jew derived from the Quran has gained a new eliminatory dimension through the admixture of world conspiracy theories. Many do not want to take note of this particularly aggressive anti-Semitism. They believe that Israel's policies are responsible for the 1,200 murders, in the hope that a different policy would eliminate this hatred of Jews. I think this is an illusion. It is wiser and safer to replace this avoidance of reality with an unflinching gaze at the historical lineages between Islamism and Nazism. Thank you very much for your attention.
Jonathan, you're muted.
Yes, thank you so much for your brilliant speeches, Jeffrey and Matthias. I think they are illuminating, they are detailed, they are full of new information that I know that many people who have listened to this program today wish to learn more about. Unfortunately, we are running out of time, and I would like to maybe ask a couple of the questions that have appeared in the chat. Let me see if I can. Yes, one question is, can you elaborate on the relation between Arab nationalist Marxist Palestinian ideology and the Islamist ideology of Hamas and Islamic Jihad? How did the latter become so popular? What actually is that connection? Because I think that is an important element.
Matthias, why don't you address it?
You can start, Jeffrey.
The connection between.
Otherwise, I would answer.
You go first.
Okay.
Like
you know, if you look at the Charter of Hamas, Article 22 says the imperialistic forces in the capitalist West and the communist East. So the Charter called both the forces of infidelity. So there was a kind of rejection of Soviet communism and Marxism among the Islamists of Hamas. On the other hand, they use the language of revolutionaries. They are talking about imperialism. They are talking about the masses are part of Hamas members and Hamas members are part of the masses. So this sounds like the Cultural Revolution in China. And so it was an impulse from the communist revolution. But then, you know, the charter was made in '88. and this was a time in Moscow of glasnost and perestroika. The old rulers were already, giving up. Gorbachev had to fight. The Communist Party in Russia was dissolved. And so the fall of Marxism in the Soviet Union strengthens Hamas because the PLO was weakened very much. The PLO was a partner of Moscow, and now after the fall of Moscow, PLO had not so much to say, but Hamas could switch in, and I will quote Ahmad Khomeini, quote, "After the fall of Marxism, Islam replaced it." So this is maybe most important thing. And indeed, since then, Islamism has been the only remaining force that presents a consistent ideological alternative to capitalism, which is endowed with enormous financial resources and which has a global reach. So that makes clear how big the danger is coming from Islamist worldwide conspiracy.
I would just add this, and this refers to Jonathan's remarks at the outset. In my 2014 essay, I noticed that many historians who themselves were left-wing but not Islamist repeated Hamas propaganda. And the 2017 statement is an effort to make Hamas appear part of the global left, which it is not. So profoundly, one implication of what both of us have said is that this is a profoundly reactionary organization. It's moving to the extreme right. It is not part of a global leftist communist movement, but its enemies are the same as those of the global left: American imperialism, the state of Israel, capitalism, it is what we have seen is I find it very peculiar that young people who regard themselves on our campuses and off the campuses as liberal or leftist, refer to themselves as the activist left, either refuse to criticize Hamas or even at times seem to support it. So I'm at a loss to understand why they find it so acceptable to celebrate a reactionary organization. And the only answer I can come up with is because they say, well, we don't agree with what Hamas says about gays, about women, about theocracy. No, we don't think that the religion of Judaism is despicable. But after all, they are attacking Israel. And so they can't be all. Sometimes it just amounts to something. Can we continue a few more minutes?
Well, yes, we can, if people wish to stay on, as I hope they do. Let me see. Yes. Can you speak a little bit more about the revision of the Hamas Charter and the extent to which it appears, and I have heard it referred to from time to time as a real revision of the charter and an attempt at ameliorating some of the extremism of the charter. Can you go into a little bit more detail about that and the extent to which it either simply perpetuated the same ideas in different language or actually did constitute a change of direction?
I wrote an essay in the American Purpose magazine, published in Washington in November of this past November, called "From the River to the Sea." I don't think it's behind a paywall, and it's a part of a little bibliography that we've created with this series. And I examined that 2017 statement in considerable detail. So I would suggest we look at that. Or to be very brief now, the 2017 statement rejects what it calls the Zionist entity, and it defines Palestinian rights as the right of return of all the refugees to the state of what is then Israel, and that right of return would amount to the destruction of Israel as a Jewish state. It calls for resisting the occupation with all means and methods. But it performed a kind of magic trick by presenting a profoundly reactionary organization as a cause célèbre of the global left. And one of the great fears of a Jewish student at an American university is to be called a conservative. A few things can be worse, right? Not to mention a racist. Israel is racist. Israel will, of course. One implication of what we're saying today is that those people who have been so self-righteous for many years we should push them a bit back on their heels. What are you doing supporting a reactionary racist and a reactionary organization? Maybe you're not as left-wing as you think you are. At least entertain some second thoughts.
I would
Please.
like to add that I think this paper, the Document of General Principles of 2017, it served a special purpose to cheat the public. And it's successful because even within the security services of Israel, people didn't think of the Charter of Hamas, but thought they can take seriously the Document of General Principles, that something had changed with Hamas. But it was not true. It was a kind of cheating, the public and the Israeli security services. And so for me, it's no question that this Document of General Principles has no sense anymore after October 7.
I think, is the sound all right? Can you hear me well?
I think if you move because
I'm very close to the microphone at the moment. Is that not working?
it may be the best we can do. It's not perfect, but
All right.
let me see.
Well, let's go on to the next question.
Okay. One question that I saw, and I think it's on many people's minds, is the question of, and of course, it's the question people asked about Mein Kampf and about a variety of other statements by totalitarian leaders over many years, is can you take the words seriously? To what extent do we have to take the words seriously? Now, I think the three of us take those words seriously. I think that we believe that the articulation of these ideas has consequences, real consequences in the world. But how do you make that clear, as opposed to, are these words simply coming up out of the anger of a people who feels that it is the object of continuous oppression by first colonialist and then Zionist forces over it?
I come to this discussion with the biases and the inclinations of a historian of modern German history. I admit that. And for we historians of the Nazi regime, whether it's Karl Bracher in the 50s or Ian Kershaw later, or in my own work, what we believe we have demonstrated is that when Hitler said that he was going to kill the Jews, he meant it. But the intelligence agencies in Britain and the United States were skeptical. They thought, well, this must be serving some other purpose, some other interest. Part of the greatness of Hannah Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism, which is a problematic book in many ways, but its best part is that she understood that Hitler and Goebbels meant what they said. So there's a methodological issue that I bring to this work as an intellectual, political, and cultural historian, in which I see that there are moments when ideas are the driving forces, the key causal variables in explaining why events happen. And ever since the UN partition resolution of 1947, there has been an alternative of a peaceful resolution and the creation of two states. And consistently, because of these ideas, that alternative has been rejected. The Islamists have been the driving force that stood in the way of that compromise. So it's a long discussion, and it involves a lot of discussion about historical method and interpretation, but yes, we take ideas seriously.
I would like to recommend Jeffrey Herf's book, The Jewish Enemy, on this topic, which is very, very useful for this whole debate. And I also think, like Jeffrey, that genocidal ideas represent genocidal intents. We saw this with Hitler, we saw this now with the Hamas, and we are still ignoring what is going on by the leadership of Tehran. So I would say, if the only lesson we could learn from the October 7th massacre is to take such threats of annihilation seriously in the future, the Iranian leadership really believes that it is following a religious instruction when it completely destroys the Jewish state of Israel. We have to take that seriously. This is a madness, but it must be taken terribly seriously. In this sense, the lessons of October 7 need to be discussed, I would say.
There's another point to be made here, a point about Benjamin Netanyahu's mistake. I'm a severe critic of Benjamin Netanyahu. But if you're the prime minister of Israel, you face the decision of whether or not to go to war with Hamas, knowing that it has built all these tunnels, and then the only way to defeat it will inevitably bring about not only deaths of Israeli soldiers, but those civilians that Hamas is using to protect its weapons. So who wants to go to war? Wouldn't it be much better to try to buy them off, to send billions of dollars into Gaza, to try to create some way in which they'll forget about the Hamas charter and think about a better life? It didn't work. It didn't work at all. It was a huge miscalculation, but it was a miscalculation that was not only Netanyahu, as Matthias pointed out. It was a miscalculation in the Israeli military and intelligence services. And why? Because they are human beings and they don't want to go to war. And they hope you can avoid war, and that the historians like Jeffrey Herf or Karl Bracher are wrong, and that these ideas are not the driving force of history, and that people want a nice villa on the beachfront and they want a Mercedes-Benz, and that's more important than the Hamas charter. So, you know, it's not always popular to be a historian, but this is my own.
Great.
Well, I think we could spend another 2 hours talking about all of these subjects, and I wish that we could. Unfortunately, I think we do have to bring this program to a conclusion. And before we leave, I want to thank both of our speakers again very, very much. And I think the presentations were brilliant and illuminating. And we have, through the YIVO store, many of the books by Jeffrey Herf and Matthias Küntzel that one can order. We have recorded this, and it will be available on YouTube in the very near future. And before we leave for today, I do want to mention some upcoming programs that I think will interest people who have tuned in today. And the first of these is the second installment of this program, Colonialism, Racism, and the Arab-Israeli War, 1948, which is a discussion between Benny Morris and Jeffrey Herf. And the next is Responses to October 7th, which is a discussion among Jeffrey Herf and Mayor Litvak, Norman Goda, Karin Stegner, and David Hirsch. In addition to these upcoming programs, I do want to mention, since it was referred to several times in this program, a program that we are going to have on April the 10th at 7 p.m. It will be in the auditorium at YIVO, it will not be on Zoom, and it is on the protocols of the Elders of Zion in the court of the Bern trial with a foremost historian of the protocols, Michael Hagemeister. In addition, on Tuesday, March 19th, there will be a program called Reimagining the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict, which will be a discussion between Marwan Muasher, who is Vice President for Studies at the Carnegie Endowment, formerly the Jordanian ambassador to Israel, and Daniel C. Kurtzer, who is formerly the US ambassador to Israel. So with that, I want to yet again thank Jeffrey and Matthias. Thank all of you for coming. Thank Alex Weiser and Julia Rothkopf for all of their great work in making this program possible. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.